Ever had to confront someone older than you and stand your ground?
I remember the moment my parents told me that we could only afford one ticket, and it felt like someone had just shoved a knife into my chest. I had been working my ass off all year, covering bills that barely left me with anything for myself, making sure the house stayed in order, and doing everything I could to keep them from worrying about money, and still, when the opportunity came for a family trip, I was the one left behind. My sister got the ticket, and not just a regular ticket either, a luxury package with all the extras, while I stayed home, responsible for everything that still needed doing. I tried to hide the frustration, smiled, and congratulated her, but inside I was boiling. It was one thing to be left out, it was another to see her get praised, celebrated, and told she deserved it. They made it sound like I should be happy for her, that I would understand, but understanding didn't cover the sinking feeling of being completely invisible to the people who should have cared the most. As soon as they left, I started thinking about all the sacrifices I had made without anyone acknowledging them. I had paid for utilities, covered unexpected expenses, helped with car repairs, and managed medical bills for my little brother, who couldn't even do the math yet. All of it had been my responsibility, quietly, without complaint, but now it seemed that everything I had done was invisible the moment my sister's smile became the highlight of the week. I kept reminding myself that I was better than resentment, but there was this raw edge to my feelings, a sense that finally, I needed to take stock of what I had been giving and what I had been denied. I found myself sitting down with my laptop, going through statements, receipts, and old emails, and it hit me just how much I had been carrying without recognition. Every payment, every favor, every small sacrifice I had made for them had quietly disappeared into their world, and now it was my turn to start thinking about what I could do for myself. The first night was hard. I could hear them in the background calling my sister, telling her how amazing everything was, what a great choice they had made, how they couldn't believe how lucky she was. Meanwhile, I was making sure the bills got paid on time, that groceries were stocked, and that nothing fell apart while they were gone. I hated that they had no idea how much I was doing, but the thought of them realizing it too soon made me pause. I didn't want to react out of anger. I wanted this to count. I wanted it to matter when the time came, when I finally made my move. And I started thinking about all the little ways I could assert myself without them knowing at first. I went through their financial arrangements, seeing where I could quietly take control without raising alarms. It was not about theft or cruelty. It was about showing them that I had power too, that ignoring me came with consequences they hadn't anticipated. As the days passed, I noticed just how dependent they were on me. I handled phone calls from the cable company, reminded them about auto-pay deadlines, even answered emails they had no idea needed responses. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of their world relied on my attention to detail and patience. My sister was having the time of her life, posting updates, bragging about experiences I would never have, while I stayed home, managing every mundane responsibility that kept the house running. At first, it stung, but then it became clarity. I wasn't powerless. I had been invisible in their eyes, sure, but now I could use that to my advantage. I could make them realize, in ways they could not ignore, just what they had been taking for granted. By the middle of the week, I had compiled a list of every bill I had covered, every expense I had shouldered, and every instance where my parents had failed to even notice. The more I looked, the more I realized how easy it would be to quietly pull back, to redirect resources that had always gone unnoticed and underappreciated. I could make a few strategic adjustments, make things just a little more complicated for them, and they would be forced to see how much work I had done all along. I wasn't thinking about revenge in the cruel sense. I was thinking about leverage, power, control, the sense that I could finally stop being invisible and make them face the truth of what they had been doing. On the last night before they returned, I sat at my desk, going over my notes one more time. I had made small adjustments that would start to show immediately, subtle ones that only someone paying attention would notice. Bills that had been automatically handled were now set to notify me first. Payments I had covered quietly were moved to accounts that only I controlled, and every dollar I had been responsible for was accounted for. I didn't feel guilty. I felt alive. I had waited silently, and now I was ready. When they came home, the smiles and stories of my sister's trip would meet a wall of calm, calculated action. They wouldn't know yet what had happened, but they would start to feel it. I was ready to turn the tables, and I knew that by the time they realized it, it would be too late. They thought leaving me behind made me powerless, but that assumption was about to be shattered, and I could hardly wait to see the look on their faces. The next morning, I packed a small bag, not for a vacation, but for a disappearance that would make every single person realize that leaving me behind had consequences they never considered. I shut off my laptop, took one last look at the statements, and walked out the door, knowing I would return only when it suited me. They came home, expecting their routine to be intact, expecting to find me quietly taking care of everything, and instead they would find that the quietest person in the house had finally disappeared, leaving them to face the chaos I had always prevented. And I smiled, because for the first time in my life, I felt untouchable, and it was only the beginning. By the time my parents were halfway across the country with my sister, I had already started mapping out everything they assumed I would never notice, going line by line through statements, bills, and old receipts to see exactly where I had been carrying them without recognition, and I realized that for years I had been the invisible backbone of the household, keeping everything afloat while they basked in the relief of my effort without ever acknowledging it. I remembered every time I covered an overdue utility payment, every single grocery run I had done to save them stress, every late-night call I had taken to straighten out insurance or repair issues, and as I reviewed all of it, the anger that had been simmering turned into a kind of clarity, because I realized that invisibility could be a powerful tool if I played it right. And for the first time, I began to see a way to turn my unrecognized labor into leverage in a situation where everyone thought they were in control. I did not act impulsively because this was not about a tantrum or immediate retaliation. This was about establishing a foundation for a plan that would be inescapable, precise, and undeniable, and I could feel a sense of focus I had never experienced before. Like I had finally found the one arena where I could assert myself and make them recognize what they had ignored for so long. I began documenting everything carefully, listing each bill I had paid for utilities, credit cards, and unexpected emergencies, noting the exact amounts, dates, and situations, and as I filled out my spreadsheet, I also began to cross-reference what had been credited to the household accounts and what had never been acknowledged, and the disparities were staggering. Because it became obvious that my parents had relied on me to cover certain expenses while presenting themselves as responsible planners and decision-makers, and in that contrast, I found a kind of hidden power that I could exploit, because they assumed the safety and security of the home rested solely in their choices, but in reality it had rested on me the whole time, and I could see that now more clearly than ever. Every evening I spent checking the statements. I would imagine the conversations that would follow when they returned, the incredulity on their faces as they began to notice the subtle changes I had implemented, the minor complications that would arise from accounts I had quietly adjusted, and the realization that I had quietly created the leverage to turn their assumptions about control completely upside down filled me with an unexpected satisfaction that I had learned to suppress over the years, but which now was rising naturally and sharply. While they were posting pictures from lavish excursions, claiming experiences I had no access to, I did not lash out on social media or call them to complain, because I understood that every reaction I made needed to be measured and strategic. And instead I used the images and posts as reinforcement for my plan, letting their arrogance and pride become my fuel, because I could see clearly that they had assumed their attention and praise would always be with my sister, that my silence would continue to be interpreted as compliance, and that was exactly what I was going to use against them, letting them think that the house and everything in it would continue without disruption, while in reality I was quietly asserting control in ways they could not yet recognize or prevent. I began to notice small habits, things they had neglected that I had always managed without comment, and I started subtly adjusting them, setting reminders to intercept payments or to redirect attention in ways that would complicate their returns without appearing as rebellion, because the plan required them to feel powerless to prevent the changes I was making while thinking everything was normal, and in that delicate tension, I began to take a quiet satisfaction in the growing power dynamic shift. As the days went on, I also began preparing for what I knew would be the moment they realized something had changed, imagining how they would call and demand explanations, how my calm and reasonable responses would deflect blame while showing them, quietly, that I was the one holding the strings, and in that mental rehearsal I found a clarity and precision in my thinking that felt almost intoxicating, because it confirmed that my years of being undervalued had not diminished my intelligence or my capability to act when the moment was right. Every adjustment I made to accounts, every reallocation of responsibilities, every small disruption I had planted, was a way to reclaim not just the respect I had been denied, but a way to assert my presence as someone whose work and effort could no longer be ignored, and by the time the end of their trip approached, I felt a growing sense of inevitability, that the moment of reckoning was coming, that they would arrive expecting ease and find instead a carefully structured challenge that only I could control, and in that realization, I understood for the first time that I was no longer invisible, that my value was undeniable, and that my plan was approaching the moment where it would have its first tangible impact, changing the dynamics of our family forever. By the last night of their trip, I had traced every responsibility I had shouldered, every uncredited effort, and quietly altered the ways in which those responsibilities would be executed upon their return, and in that meticulous preparation, I knew that I was no longer the powerless child left behind, but someone with clarity, control, and a capacity for subtle but absolute influence, and as I went to bed that night, I allowed myself a quiet smile, knowing that the next morning, when they walked through the door, they would begin to feel the consequences of their choices, the first hints of disruption and imbalance that I had orchestrated without their awareness, and the satisfaction of holding the power they never expected to be held by me, gave me a confidence and anticipation that I had never experienced before. When my parents walked back into the house, the first thing I noticed was how completely they assumed everything would be as they left it, that nothing had changed, and for a moment, I almost laughed at the arrogance that comes with ignorance, because they had spent the entire week showing off my sister and telling anyone who would listen about the trip and how responsible I had been to stay behind, and yet they had no idea that the very things they took for granted had quietly shifted under their noses, and I was ready to let the first ripple of disruption hit without revealing that it was intentional, because the power of this plan depended on subtlety, on letting them believe they were still in control while the first cracks began to appear in the structure they had always assumed was solid. I greeted them politely, asked about their trip, listened to every story with careful interest, and made sure to appear engaged and calm, but inside, I was already running through the sequence I had mapped out, every step of the disruption and every point where they would notice something was off, and I felt a thrill that came from the knowledge that this time I was not the overlooked sibling or the one left behind, but the one who had orchestrated the very first moment of reckoning. The first sign came in the form of the utility bills that I had quietly set to alert me first, so when the water company called asking for clarification on a payment, I had the perfect opportunity to step in and handle it calmly while my parents stood by, confused and a little unsettled, because they had always assumed that everything would run smoothly without my intervention. And seeing the first flicker of doubt in their faces was almost delicious, a quiet acknowledgement that I had not been invisible, that I had been quietly watching, preparing, and acting, and the knowledge that this small but precise maneuver had set the tone for the next stage of the plan filled me with a sense of control and anticipation that I had never felt before. My sister, oblivious to any tension, was busy unpacking souvenirs and recounting her adventures, completely unaware that the foundation of their household had begun to shift in a way that she could not yet perceive, and I used her distraction to my advantage, making small adjustments, checking statements, and ensuring that each action I took would ripple outward in a way that created increasing uncertainty for my parents, without revealing my hand. Within a day, the effects of my quiet manipulations began to compound, with missed reminders, payment notifications landing in unexpected accounts, and subtle alerts that caught my parents off guard, and every time they looked to me for an explanation, I remained calm and logical, providing precise information that forced them to realize that something had changed, that the smooth operations they relied on were no longer entirely within their grasp, and that every year of overlooked work I had done suddenly mattered in a way that could not be ignored. I could see the worry start to creep into their expressions, the silent question forming between them as they glanced at one another, trying to make sense of why things were not going according to their expectations. And I knew that the first seeds of accountability were taking root, that they were beginning to understand the subtle power I had always held but never needed to assert, and that for the first time, the quiet, consistent labor I had performed for years was becoming visible in the most undeniable way. As the day progressed, I began to implement more complex adjustments, carefully pulling together financial threads that intersected in ways they had never considered. Redirecting responsibilities that had been mine for years in ways that created immediate confusion without triggering suspicion that it was deliberate, and I watched as their confident assumptions began to crumble under the weight of their own reliance on me. The realization dawning slowly but surely that I had been managing everything they now found themselves struggling to comprehend. I maintained the appearance of calm and helpfulness, answering questions, resolving minor issues, and providing guidance, but with every action, I ensured that they experienced the subtle but unmistakable power shift, that every interaction reminded them that I had been the quiet engine behind the household, and that my absence would have created chaos, and my presence now commanded attention and respect that they had never given before. By the time the evening arrived, my parents were visibly unsettled, my sister was still oblivious, and I felt a steady sense of satisfaction knowing that the first phase of the plan had unfolded exactly as intended, that the initial disruption had created ripples that would only grow stronger with each day, and that every small moment of confusion or doubt was a direct result of the careful orchestration I had put in place while they were distracted by their trip and their pride in my sister. I went to bed that night with a sense of quiet triumph, knowing that I had successfully inserted the first move into a chain of events that would culminate in a reckoning, that my careful attention to detail and patient planning had given me the leverage I needed, and that they had begun to understand, finally, that leaving me behind did not make me powerless, but had set the stage for me to reclaim not just recognition, but authority, and in that moment, I felt a clarity and anticipation that assured me I was exactly where I needed to be to complete the plan, and that the next moves would escalate in ways they could not anticipate. I knew that patience was my most powerful weapon because every move I had made so far had been invisible, every adjustment subtle enough that my parents believed the household still functioned smoothly. And the tension I felt was not impatience, but a quiet calculation of when to escalate, because the timing had to be impeccable to make the impact undeniable and irreversible, and I understood that if I acted too soon, the chaos would be small and easily dismissed, but if I waited too long, the opportunity to maximize the leverage I had gained would slip away, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely in control of the situation that had always seemed unchangeable. I began mapping every interaction, every routine, and every expectation they had, tracing the invisible web of reliance they had unknowingly built around me for years. And I realized that the culmination of my plan would be strongest if I struck at the point where every assumption collided with reality, because that moment would force them to confront not just the disruption, but the truth of how much they had depended on me without ever acknowledging it. I started with the bills I had been managing quietly for years, letting small discrepancies appear in ways that seemed accidental, nothing obvious enough to accuse me of manipulation, but enough that it caused immediate frustration and confusion. And I watched as they tried to reconcile the unexpected statements, retrace payments, and make sense of the numbers, all the while assuming that I had no part in the changes, that I was still the compliant daughter who waited behind while my sister enjoyed the luxury they could only afford one ticket for, and I held my calm, answering their questions with precise and polite explanations, never revealing that every minor complication had been intentionally orchestrated to create the first wave of accountability. My sister remained oblivious, happily recounting every meal, every tour, every small extravagance, unaware that the foundation of the household she relied on was being quietly restructured without her noticing, and the contrast between her carefree celebration and the tension I had inserted into my parents' routines gave me a strange satisfaction that only comes from long years of overlooked effort finally being acknowledged, even indirectly, through their bewilderment and forced attention. Every interaction over the next few days became a test of observation and control, because I needed them to recognize the consequences of leaving me behind without making the plan obvious. And each misdirected payment or delayed notice was a calculated move to show them that their reliance on me was not optional, that the comfort and security they had assumed would continue on autopilot depended entirely on my attention and intervention. And as they struggled to navigate the small, precise disruptions I had planted, I could see their frustration growing, that subtle shift from smug confidence to unease that had been the first indication that my quiet manipulations were beginning to succeed. And the satisfaction of seeing them forced to recognize my invisible contributions was almost intoxicating in its validation. I also began reaching into responsibilities that were less obvious, areas they had assumed were insignificant or had never questioned, quietly adjusting schedules, redirecting routine tasks, and gently nudging systems that had always relied on my intervention, so that the effects would accumulate in ways that appeared coincidental to them, but were unmistakable in pattern to anyone paying attention. And I knew that by the time they realized the scope of the disruption, it would be too late to attribute it to chance, too late to regain the illusion of control, and every day of their confusion reinforced the invisible but undeniable power I had quietly reclaimed. I deliberately allowed small arguments to flare, subtle moments of tension where they questioned each other about the missing or altered information, all carefully choreographed to highlight the gaps in understanding that their dependence on me had created. And I watched the shift in their demeanor as they began to understand that the child they had left behind was not powerless, but in fact the architect of the challenges they now faced, and that every year of dismissing me had left them unprepared for this level of precise disruption. The real turning point came when I quietly consolidated all the information I had gathered about every bill, every uncredited payment, and every financial decision I had managed. And I began preparing for the moment when they would finally have to confront the fact that their reliance on me had not been acknowledged, that leaving me behind had created an opportunity for a reckoning that was as deliberate as it was inevitable. And I could feel the anticipation building in my chest because I knew that the final stage, the one that would leave them speechless and force them to recognize the full extent of my careful, quiet planning, was approaching, that the stage was set for them to understand that leaving me behind had been their mistake, and that I was about to turn that mistake into a moment of undeniable clarity and satisfaction, a reckoning that would make them realize, perhaps for the first time, that I had always been the one keeping everything together and that my presence was not something to be ignored. When the final pieces fell into place, it was nothing like the quiet manipulations I had carried out before. This was the moment where every calculation, every patient adjustment, and every subtle act of preparation collided into a reality my parents could no longer ignore, and I remember standing there, listening to the chaos I had orchestrated unfold in real time, feeling a mix of satisfaction, relief, and an almost disarming clarity, because this was the moment where the invisible control I had always exerted became undeniable, where leaving me behind had transformed from an act of dismissal into a catalyst for a reckoning that they could not soften with excuses, reassurances, or denial. And I realized that for years I had waited not for recognition, but for the opportunity to demonstrate just how significant my presence had always been. The first shock came when they discovered that every account, every bill, and every payment I had once managed with quiet diligence had shifted in ways that were completely beyond their comprehension. And instead of the usual calm resolution they expected from me, they found nothing predictable, nothing easily explained, and every attempt to reconcile the chaos only magnified their sense of helplessness. And it was not that I had taken money or destroyed anything, but that I had shown them, through precise control and careful timing, that the structure they relied on was entirely dependent on me, and that leaving me behind had not removed me from their world. but had instead allowed me to finally expose the full weight of their neglect in a way that could not be ignored. I could see my sister's confusion as well, the way she hesitated while recounting stories of her trip, realizing that my absence was not just physical, but now carried consequences she had never considered. And it became clear that she had always benefited from the foundation I had built without acknowledging it, and watching her slowly connect the dots between my role and the household's smooth operation was a strange mixture of vindication and quiet amusement, because for years she had been the one praised for taking opportunities while I remained overlooked, and now the imbalance had been corrected not by confrontation, but by the undeniable fact that I had reclaimed control and highlighted their oversight with precision and subtlety. By the time my parents started to confront the reality of the situation, I remained composed, presenting facts with measured calm, answering their panicked questions without judgment or indulgence, but with the weight of truth that left no room for denial. And I could see the recognition settle in slowly, the unspoken understanding that for years they had underestimated my contributions, that every expectation they took for granted rested on the quiet work of someone they dismissed, and that the luxury they afforded my sister had been a choice that overlooked the value of the effort I had invested daily, and now the consequences of that choice had become a lesson too precise, too complete, and too deliberate to be ignored. What followed was not chaos for the sake of revenge, but the clarity of authority and the brilliance of timing, as I revealed the culmination of weeks of careful planning and patient observation, demonstrating that every minor disruption, every delay, and every adjustment had been intentional, and watching the realization in my parents' faces as they understood that I had orchestrated the entire sequence was a moment of quiet triumph, because it was not just about punishment, but about asserting control, demanding recognition, and finally tipping the scales in a way that felt clever, deserved, and emotionally satisfying. And as they absorbed the impact, the tension, the frustration, and the shock, I could sense the weight of accountability settle onto them, a weight they could not shrug off with excuses or denial. By the evening, the house had a strange calm, not because the disruption had ended, but because the clarity had set in, and I could feel the shift in the air as my parents, once confident and unthinking, now realized that their dismissal had created the exact situation they feared, and that the control I had always wielded quietly was now fully visible, undeniable, and absolute in its consequences, and I felt a sense of closure, of power reclaimed, and of justice delivered in the sharpest, most satisfying way possible without cruelty or spectacle, because every step had been measured, every act had been precise, and every consequence had been designed to ensure that leaving me behind would never again be taken lightly. And as I walked through the house that night, hearing the subdued conversations, the hesitant questions, and the acknowledgement that my absence would have caused real disruption, I realized that the reckoning was complete, that I had turned the tables in a way they could not reverse, and that the brilliance of the plan lay not in drama or confrontation, but in the quiet, calculated demonstration of undeniable truth. Leaving them to process what they had taken for granted and me to enjoy the satisfaction of having finally reclaimed what was always mine, and in that moment, I understood that victory was not loud, but precise, inevitable, and entirely my own.